But I want to suggest that, in fact, and we've been exploring this, that we are all connected. And so my guess is maybe not everyone, but probably most of us had something to eat or drink this morning, or are planning to later today. And I'm sure we plan to tomorrow and the next day. And my guess is we probably don't have, we may not have some very specific barriers that we really feel like, oh, I might not be able to eat tomorrow. And so simply by virtue of partaking in that bounty of the earth, we are connected. I am connected. We used to live in Mexico for a number of years with the Mennonite Central Committee, and a couple of times I would actually get to harvest coffee cherries. That might even sound interesting, but to harvest coffee, by virtue of drinking coffee this morning, and every morning, I am connected to those that are stewarding that landscape. By having that slice of toast, I'm connected, or my oatmeal this morning, I'm connected to those that are farming just on the outskirts of Saskatoon. We are connected, and we do have an influence. Maybe small, but aggregated together, we do have an influence on how land is managed and how land is stewarded, how water is stewarded. Now, there is a tension that obviously exists because we can see that, hey, there's a lot of land in the world that might not be stewarded in an ideal way, and there's a lot of breakdown to the system. And I think in some ways that just simply reflects the brokenness of our world. It reflects the fact or reality that even our best intentions around systems and how to make a large food system work, that there's breakdown. It's incomplete. It doesn't function as it should. And there's lots of reasons for it, and we don't have time to go into all that complexity. But I will note one thing, and this is kind of connected to our brokenness in terms of a world that is impacted by sin. We often, we collectively, there can be a focus on the short term, kind of around the short-term gain, the sense of how does it help me, this kind of the sense of security, having a me focus. And that can lead to larger issues around greed, around corruption, even at larger levels. And that always has an impact. And a person needs to ask, where does that cost? Who is bearing the burden of that cost? I'll end this question just with two statements here. Food security matters because food and water are basic necessities of life. But also, they are also very important elements to being able to extend hospitality, to being able to convene community, to be able to practice peace building, to even be able to kind of make manifest God's sense of shalom, of justice. And by virtue of that, creation care matters as well, because God essentially delegated the stewardship of his house to men and women, and that includes ensuring that people have access to food.
But we tend to be a little bit stuffed. There's an overabundance. So there's the starved and the stuffed, and somewhere in the middle we may find ourselves. But that kind of overabundance is just being aware that sometimes that might lead to things like food waste, or maybe overconsumption. I don't know, but that's the other extreme of something. And so we just have to be aware of where we are coming from. And you might all be on a different spectrum of that. But to be aware that for a lot of us, we come from a place of privilege in which we have never experienced the concern of, I don't know where my next food's going to come from, or I don't know where I'm going to feed the next food to my children. We haven't experienced that. Maybe secondhand you have, but maybe not firsthand. And so we always, when we see other people struggling, I think we just have to be super careful and humble and be respectful of people that we haven't experienced that, and to not make light of people's sufferings and not avoid them, but also just to make sure we're not too simple in saying, well, if you would just do this, it would all be fine. Or, well, if you would just do that, then you'd be fine. Those type of attitudes are not helpful. They're quite hurtful. And thankfully, my experience of God is not looking down on me and saying, well, pull yourself up. What's your problem? Do something and fix yourself. He comes down and he shows compassion over and over again and generosity. And that's God's heart for me. And I think the more we receive that, we can share that. But just to be, that we have to understand where we're coming from and not to make things too simple, because they are quite complex. In every region, whether it's in Canada or Venezuela or Haiti or Lebanon or Sudan, they're all a little bit different. Unfortunately, one of the main things that we're hearing right now about food insecurity and the reasons for the rise of it, unfortunately, in the last few years, is due to conflict in our world. And we probably all are aware of places that come to mind where there's conflict. And so conflict might look for example, I was in Lebanon 2.5 years ago, and just learning and listening to Syrian refugees that have come into the country. And a lot of the stories I heard, not all of them, were people that 10 years ago were food secure. They had businesses, they had jobs, they were education, everything was good, and then that fell apart completely. And they had to flee. And they probably fled to a place maybe in Syria still, where there's so many people without employment, or they're going as refugees where they don't always have the right to work. And so they're just in a real insecure place. Or it might look like the most vulnerable people actually for being food insecure are rural peasant farmers who are subsistence farmers. They rely on their piece of land to feed themselves and their family. And so if there's conflict and you have to leave your land, you have no money in the bank. There's no government insurance or anything to help you. And so you're in a real vulnerable spot. Or you might be aware there's conflict where you live and you're nervous to put money and resources of seed into the ground because you don't know 3 months from now if you're going to be there. So conflict is, unfortunately, there are other things, disasters and things that happen from external forces that impact people for sure. But yeah, conflict. And the UN kind of study on food security kind of released this statement of really understanding right now in our world that without peace, we're not going to have food security. And without food security, we're not going to have peace.
I think, to some degree, an accurate statement would be essentially in Canada, food is plentiful, but access is a challenge. Again, that's a generalized statement. But I want to provide kind of 3 glimpses into what might be some of the more common areas in which in which there's barriers for people to access food, and by virtue experience hunger. So one would be really remote locations, remote communities. We can think of places in northern Saskatchewan, Fond du Lac, or even South End. I mean, South End is approachable by road, but at times, there might be reasons why food is not able to get into the community. A number of years ago, I worked with an organization called Heifer International, and we did work in some fly-in communities in northern Manitoba. So in God's River, where we had worked with a community group there. The first trip was quite astounding because I went into the northern store, and to see your 4-liter jug of milk cost $16, apples at $6 a pound, anything that is more in the realm of fresh and wholesome has an incredible price. The other food that has longer shelf life, marginally more expensive, but there's economic reasons why we see that. But still, that represents a significant barrier to accessing the kind of healthy food that one needs. Another scenario would be rural communities, and particularly I'm kind of referencing rural communities in Saskatchewan, in Alberta, many communities where a good amount of the economy is based on resources, natural resources, and a lot of it has frankly got to do with some of the oil resources. And so we've seen a downturn, families who have in some ways lost a lot of their income basis. And essentially, these rural communities are reporting, food bank use that they would have never maybe even dreamed. And they see the stress of families and communities. And I mean, there are fixed costs such as housing, such as keeping the lights on and it heated. And food is one of those costs that often will fluctuate. And that's where people realize, I can squeeze my dimes a little bit more if I end up going to the food bank. And so that is also a barrier to accessing food. Thirdly, I'd use this term called food deserts. And in some ways, we, to a degree, we have this here in Saskatoon, and it's often found more in city centers, kind of in urban core areas where, you're going to have to walk or bike or drive actually quite a distance to actually get to a store that sells food, fresh food. Sometimes there's convenience stores, but again, what kind of, where's the healthy food in order to encourage our physical health, that can be a distance. And for those that may be, a single parent who's working, at or near minimum wage, and maybe doesn't even have a vehicle, the idea of having to spend between $30 and $50 going to and from a grocery store in order to access food, already on a tight budget, that can be a cost that presents itself as a barrier. I'll end this question just with a story. Jackie and I, with the Food Grains Bank, we're often in spaces, especially with middle years, because food security is part of the curriculum. We'll do various activities. The Food Grains Bank, we have this kind of fun little board game. It's called Breaking the Cycle of Hunger. And it's essentially for students to get a little bit of a glimpse in terms of what is it like for a resource-poor farmer in a developing nation, and what are the factors that can really curtail getting out of that cycle of hunger, or what are the factors that help exit that cycle. And over the course of the game, this is a grade 7 girl that came up to us at the end, just kind of in private, and she said, "I get this." And that kind of hit the heart a little bit. Here's a family that she too understands that there's these conditions, that there's these larger barriers that sometimes prevent her own family from accessing food. Now, I'm sharing this not to make anyone feel too squirmy, or it's not about shame or anything, but in some ways, the whole point of sharing it is to then perhaps, particularly as the Christian church, as Christ followers, the question in a sense is, from where do we derive our security? How do I use my money? What relationship do I have with my money? And so that is in some degree perhaps questions that we can, that they do make us feel unsettled, but I think they're good and worthwhile questions to ask. I do also want to point out, in some sense, when we look at this, we might think, oh wow, are we all becoming, is this me? Well, in some ways, I have a good spoiler. There are many that are outside of this trend. There are many outliers. We know many through Saskatchewan and our work with the Food Grains Bank. I have no doubt there are many people sitting here that are outliers of that and that are giving, beyond that, and are understanding and appreciating that generosity and are wanting to, or appreciating the blessing that they receive from God and are wanting to extend that to another.